Good morning, everyone. My name is Khairi Ammar. I'm Service Sales Director for Dell Technologies in Emerging Africa and South Africa. Very glad to be with you today, discussing this important research and sharing with you some highlights about Dell Technologies, insights, and more details. I'm really happy to be with the media representatives today. You play a very important part into raising the awareness about this very important subject. And in Dell Technologies, actually, we see that the new threats and the vulnerabilities that's appearing, at really evolving exponential speed. New technologies create opportunities for innovation, and we navigate the changing landscape of work. It's imperative actually to deliver solutions that keep organizations and their employees safe. And with the breaches now happening above and below the OS level, organizations need to keep endpoints secure from anywhere. You need intelligent solutions. You need AI built into these solutions to prevent and detect a response and even recover from threats whenever and wherever it's happening. So this procedure measure, like taking a one certified, proven cybersecurity business partner to manage all these aspects of the services and the software is what we see as the best approach. And this is what we hear from our valued business partners and customers as well. On the same thing, we see that it's important that software and the services, and again, with artificial intelligence, built into this kind of software and systems, combined with a single point of ownership, a single point of call from services perspective is very important in reducing the risk. Customers are not always comfortable with the fact that a multi-vendor siloed kind of accountability is not in itself, fixing all the problems. Actually, it can introduce some risks as well. So this kind of a single vendor kind of end-to-end responsibility from identifying your highest vulnerable assets, making sure that you are able to prevent, detect, and respond and recover. In the same time, using, again, a single point of accountability is very important for them to protect their business critical data and make sure that the services are going continuously at the right level of availability and reliability to the end customers as well. So making sure that your data is fully protected, your services are continuing at the right pace without any kind of disruption is something that our customers are telling us. And I think it's proven from the research as well that a single vendor strategy, looking at things end to end, working in a business partnership is actually the perfect model for them that needs to be taken into account for full protection, hopefully. So happy, to go further through, the details of this great research, and happy to share any insights accordingly. Thank you so much.
Welcome to the release of another major research project from World Wide Worx. This time, the State of Cybersecurity in South Africa 2022, conducted on behalf of Dell Technologies and Intel. For this survey, we interviewed 100 key decision makers at major corporations in South Africa. So the focus is on the enterprise and the role and impact of cybersecurity on large enterprises in South Africa. Of the 100 companies we surveyed, for 91 we interviewed the IT decision maker, and for another 9 we spoke to C-level decision makers. And of those we interviewed, 90% had been in their roles for more than a year, which means they really understood what was happening in their organizations. So the first key question we asked them was how much they invested in cybersecurity relative to what they saw as the industry average. And we found that 68% of companies had invested above the industry average, which suggests a fairly high level of significance attached to cybersecurity. In fact, of those, 27% said that they had interviewed well above the industry average, and were industry leading in terms of their investment in cybersecurity. The key question that goes hand in hand with how much you've invested is how important cybersecurity is to your overall business strategy. So just because you've invested above or at the industry average is not a reflection of how core cybersecurity is to business strategy. That is a whole different story. And it's a story that tells you the extent to which organizations understand how important cybersecurity is, not just to keeping the lights on, but to in fact growing the business and achieving the business goals. So that's why this becomes a crucial question. And 5 years ago, maybe half of the respondents would have said that cybersecurity is critical to business strategy. They would have said, certainly at 100% level, that it's important to the business. In terms of business strategy, in 2022, 91% of enterprises said that it's highly important in business strategy, and a further 8% said somewhat important. In other words, 99% of major enterprises now see cybersecurity as critical to their business strategy or important in their business strategy. I now hand you over to Brian Turner to talk more about the technical aspects of the research.
Hi, I'm Brian, and I'll be walking you through the more technical aspects of the report. One of our focus points was on security frameworks and how corporates make use of them. When we asked the corporates which security frameworks they used, a large proportion of them took a mixture of approaches, using several different solutions together. What was nearly common, though, was around 60% of the businesses had hired external companies to manage their cybersecurity, while another 40% said that they were using internally managed off-the-shelf solutions. This shows the growing need for cybersecurity professionals in South Africa, and since there was a much lower 23% proportion of respondents that actually hired these professionals in their companies is telling. The single one respondent who didn't have a structured security framework will likely find themselves in trouble. Cybersecurity is like data insurance. In many cases, if a corporate doesn't pay for it, they'll likely be sorry. When looking at actual solutions, there seems to be a consensus on one technology in particular: VPN access to internal systems. An overwhelming 98% of corporates said they use this technology, which has become far more popular since the onset of remote working. Cloud platform managed security is used by nearly 9 in 10 corporates, showing, once again, how important it is to have a remote working setup that is cloud first. Now that employees are taking their Trusted Protection Module, or TPM, and Secure Boot, nearly 4 in 5 corporates say that their employees are using devices that support both, meaning that they are likely to be able to run the latest version of Windows and obtain the security updates that go along with them. Secured devices and hardware are great, but how secure is data in transit and data at rest? We put these questions to the decision makers, and an overwhelming 95% of them had said that their company was encrypting data in transit. When you see the padlock in the browser address bar, that means the data is encrypted in transit. What's more interesting, though, is around half the respondents say that they're encrypting data at rest, which means that the other half either don't know or they're not encrypting data at rest, which means that they may have the padlock at the top of the website to say that, look, you're secure, but the data that's stored might be stored without encryption. That is a very scary stat to me, and that is a very real situation that may happen to corporates, especially as we've seen now with TransUnion. And let's say disaster does strike. How many businesses will be prepared? 99% of South African corporates have a disaster management or backup solution in place. But let's zoom into the 1%. Only one company out of 100 surveyed had experienced financial loss due to a data leak. And can you guess when that happened? It happened before the onset of remote working. And can you guess what it cost them? A whopping 1 million rand. And that's just on a data leak alone. I'm going to hand back to Arthur now to talk more about threats and prevention measures.
Thanks, Brian. So what was interesting there was that the data breach occurred before the onset of remote working, which raises the question of just how many people are working remotely and what impact has that had on the rise of threats, not breaches in themselves, but threats of breaches. And we found that a remarkably low proportion of companies have no one working remotely at all. 7% of companies said that 0% of their staff work remotely. A fairly high proportion, 50%, said that only up to a quarter of their staff, 1 to 25%, work remotely on a regular basis. And then a further 21% said that between a quarter and a half of their staff work remotely regularly. Another 16% put it at between 51 and 75%, in other words, up to 3/4. And then a mere 6% said that it was between 75% and 100% of staff working remotely regularly. So what you can see from those numbers is a fairly wide spread of strategies with regard to remote working. So given this range of approaches to remote working, one would expect to see quite a dramatic increase in exposure to data loss, not loss itself, but exposure, and therefore having to mitigate for that exposure. But surprisingly, we didn't see the expected 90 to 100% increase in this kind of exposure. In fact, the increase was 45% of companies seeing somewhat more threats and 0 seeing dramatically more threats. In other words, the threat landscape has been around for some years now in terms of growing exposure to data loss, and it's not merely a factor of the pandemic. The next really interesting question that we asked was what difficulties companies experience with the security measures that are in place in their organizations. And this was possibly one of the key findings of the entire research project. And that was that 51% of companies said they had not budgeted enough for cybersecurity. In other words, half of major corporations in South Africa don't budget enough. They spend enough, but usually after the fact, usually after they realize that they need to spend more than the budget allows. And then hand in hand with that was that 1/3 of major corporations said that training staff in cybersecurity, whether it's awareness or whether it's response to cybersecurity threats, was a major difficulty in terms of the security measures that they originally put in place. So clearly it's not all wine and roses when it comes to protection, being protected, and having enough budget for that protection. So with remote working, we are finding that there are not just obstacles, but also vulnerabilities that emerge behind the scenes, or even in terms of companies that are fully protected, not experiencing breaches, but having to fight fires all the time. And the single biggest fire that they're fighting when it comes to concerns about remote working and endpoint security is the devices themselves being used by staff actually going missing, lost, or stolen. People still leave their cell phones or their laptops in bars, believe it or not, because if you're working remotely, you're working from quite a wide variety of places, and very often your distractions in those places and the fact that it also isn't your standard place of work means that there's a higher chance than ever before of devices going missing for one reason or another. And then hand in hand with that, a big concern that emerges, and this is among 35% of respondents, is that non-company users are able to access company data, whether it's on the missing devices or because people are using their devices in places where they don't usually and don't take the precautions that they would usually. And then when you are protected, other issues emerge. And this was cited also by 35% of respondents. And that was slow data processing speeds due to end-to-end security protocols. So you have the security in place, you are fully protected, but you're slowing down the ability to respond quickly to incidents or events that need a rapid response. And then finally, alongside those, equally significantly, among 34% of respondents, was an inability to control user devices and therefore feeling exposed to malicious activity because you don't have enough control over those devices. So these are issues that emerge when people are working remotely that potentially create vulnerability and therefore have the IT decision makers continually fighting fires to prevent those breaches from occurring. And the very fact that we have such a low incidence of reported breaches tells you what a great job they're doing against all the odds. Brian, over to you.
Thank you, Arthur. Let's talk about the data protection solutions that are already sitting inside the companies. We asked the corporates just how well were they protecting their data against threats like malware and ransomware. And nearly 9 in 10 said that they were able to cope with these threats, but a significant 12% proportion said that they just weren't sure. This unsure feeling is natural when facing the ever-evolving landscape of threats, and it is scary. Now that we know that most are secured, have they experienced an increase in threats over the last year? Over 2 in 5 corporates reported that they had, in fact, experienced an increase in ransomware and phishing attempts, meaning that their threat detection systems were really being put to the test. And for the viruses that slipped through the cracks, we asked corporates how they mitigated this. And 71% did exactly what you would assume, and probably what you would do too. Install software to detect and remove the malware. And just over 1 in 4 corporates had hired IT experts to come and manually remove the malware from their systems. But what's really standing out here is that no corporates paid a ransom to the attackers in the case of ransomware. And that's something to think about as I hand back to Arthur.
Thank you, Brian. We now move on to a question that will probably be the most fascinating for many media, which is the role of emerging technologies in posing a threat to data protection. And what this really means is which of the new and emerging technologies are requiring corporations to invest more heavily or pay more attention to cybersecurity, because this is not your grandfather's data protection and it's not your grandfather's technology platforms that are in use. So you certainly cannot apply traditional means of data protection in these areas. So number one, and it's not too surprising because it's the most pervasive, is cloud native applications, with 60% of respondents citing this arena as a threat or a risk in terms of data protection. And not too far behind, and at still a fairly high level, another that is emerging as a major area of threat is the Internet of Things. 53% of respondents said that the Internet of Things poses a threat or a risk in terms of data protection. Fairly far behind that came blockchain. Now, most organizations are only experimenting with it or have proofs of concept where they are working with blockchain, but they certainly see it as a threat. And I guess contributing to this perception of blockchain being a threat is the extent of fraud that is occurring around cryptocurrency losses and NFT, non-fungible token hijacking, that is reported almost weekly in the media. These don't typically affect the kind of blockchain projects or experiments going on in corporate South Africa, but they certainly create that perception and perspective of threat. And then comes number 4, which goes hand in hand with the Internet of Things as well as with cloud applications, and that is edge computing, with 30%, almost a third of respondents saying edge computing poses a risk to data protection. And why this is going to become an increasing element in the threat environment is because so much more data is now being processed at the edge. So many more endpoint devices are being drawn into the edge computing arena. And then the next 2 big ones are machine learning and artificial intelligence, both of which represent areas of limited understanding, certainly at the C level and at the decision-making level in terms of corporate strategy. At the IT level, there's a clear understanding that AI and ML can contribute to data security. But in the C-suite, there is fear and not necessarily loathing, but certainly resistance to using these technologies. But they may well represent a solution to these issues. And then areas that are not really reflected strongly in terms of fears are robotics, Kubernetes containers, virtual reality and augmented reality, and the like. And the reason for that is because of limited deployment of those technologies within the corporate environment. Finally, we come to what I regard as the most significant section of the research and the most important findings because of how they position cybersecurity within the corporate strategic environment. We should really have called this project the state of strategy in cybersecurity in South Africa, because these last 3 slides represent a dramatic shift in the thinking about cybersecurity in the corporate environment. And we asked these 3 questions. Firstly, whether companies believe that cybersecurity helps them achieve their business objectives more effectively. And a massive 94% of respondents said that they do believe that they can achieve their business objectives more effectively in a secure cybersecurity environment. Now, you'd think that's a fairly obvious question to which you're going to answer yes, but look at it in the context of the next 2 slides. Firstly, do employees feel more productive when they think their data is protected in the work environment? And this shot up to 97%, almost unanimous, that companies believe employees feel more productive. That is significant in its own right, but the last slide truly puts this in perspective. And that is 98% of respondents saying that employees can be more innovative when they know that there is strong security protocol in place. Now, that really is the big differentiator that cybersecurity brings into the corporate environment, because innovation is what sets you apart from the competition, or at the very least allows you to keep up with the competition. And if employees feel they can be more innovative, it means the organization itself becomes more innovative and therefore more able to compete or get a leap ahead of the competition. So in effect, cybersecurity is at the heart of innovation, and innovation is at the heart of competition. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arthur. For those of you who attended in the beginning, you would have seen that this presentation is going to be available at the same link. So for those of you who don't know, you can rewind and come back to this link as many times as you want to hear us talk again. And for those of you who are from the media, thank you for attending. You will receive the press pack via email later on after the presentation. We would prefer that you use the graphs that we give you in the high resolution format rather than screenshots taken here from this presentation. Now we are going to open for Q&A. I'll hand back over to Arthur now.
Thanks so much, Brian. I don't see any questions in the chat box, but that is where we will be taking the questions. So anything that you want to have clarified or elaborated on, let us know. And if there are any areas that you would like us to drill down into, you will have to contact us afterwards, because we won't be able to drill down on the fly. But it's one of the things that we can add to the findings. We will be sending out very shortly a press release that sums up what we see as the key findings, and we'll also send this presentation, the PowerPoint presentation, as a PDF, along with an infographic with some of the key findings. In the meantime, there's a question from Brendan from HTXT. Did the research look into the prevalence of ransomware extortion in South Africa? Yes, we did. In fact, Brian, you can quickly, Brian's going to join me on the same screen quickly, and he'll quickly answer that question.
Hi, Brendan. Yeah, so we know from previous research that there is quite a big incidence of ransomware incidents in SMEs. SMEs are generally more targeted towards this. Because this is now in the corporate space, when we surveyed the top 100, we had asked them, had you had an attack and what did it cost you? And then when we link back to that, it was only one, and that one corporate didn't pay the ransom. So that's what we know now from the research. Thank you.
And the next one is also for Brian. Don't go away. That's from Kirsten Doyle from IT Web. Is the company that has no frameworks in place the same as the one that has none of the usual security measures in place and doesn't upgrade endpoint hardware? Usually you find that that when you get one strategic area completely wrong, you're going to get the rest wrong as well. But Brian?
That's correct. That one company is the same company that had the attack. I'm not too sure why they didn't improve their cybersecurity framework after having that attack, but it may also be a factor of cost. And when we talk about corporates, we're also talking about industries that may not have the technical mindset first, because corporates can be anything from agriculture to IT. So it really just depends on how the corporate mindset is laid out for them.
And just to elaborate a little bit on that, a lot of companies that haven't experienced attacks have the mistaken belief that it can't happen to them simply because it hasn't happened in the past. It's not going to happen in the future. And when it does happen, it's often seen as an outlier. So I'll just give you a very rough example quickly. A lot of companies are hosted on a platform like GoDaddy, for example, and you assume that the platform looks after the security and also is able to roll back. And in fact, it doesn't. Unless you knew that it doesn't and you invested in additional protection and bought additional services from them, when you are suddenly brought down by an attack and they delete all your content, you're in deep trouble unless you have another form of rollback or backup. And often it takes companies a long time to realize that it was actually the set of services that they had bought that weren't adequate, because they don't have an external procedure and someone providing oversight. They are going on, you could say, on their own experience and knowledge. And if you're not a specialist in this area, your own experience and knowledge is woefully inadequate. And that's what we saw happening with that particular company.
And anecdotally, we've seen the major corporates like the big banks they tend to hire multiple external cybersecurity consultants, and that alludes also to, or rather references back to the point that Kyrie made in the beginning, that you have to have multiple partners, you have to get multiple solutions to cover all the bases, because it's really expensive not to. And as we've seen before, 1 billion rand is a kind of a silly figure to pay in the face of a few thousand a year, for example. So it's really just a matter of prevention. And as we said before, it's about just paying that insurance cost, that you don't suffer monetary loss, as well as don't suffer reputation loss.
Brian, this I think question is for you as well. Looking at, from Brendan again, looking at the figures of companies that looked in-house to manage off-the-shelf solutions, are there enough initiatives that are pushing for cybersecurity education? And should these initiatives be coming from government, the private sector, or both? Well, the last part of that question is that they should be coming from both, but the private sector does have to look after itself. It cannot rely on government to look after it. And government has to look after itself, but with the support and with the partnership of the private sector. I just want to elaborate before I ask Brian to just answer the question about the initiatives on education, is that I'm going to quote Kyrie, who introduced the event, who makes a very important point. He says that you need procedural measures in place, and companies that suffer breaches typically don't have adequate procedural measures in place. And we're not here to sell cybersecurity solutions at all, but one obvious procedural measure is having a certified cybersecurity partner to manage these services. Just elaborating on what we were saying earlier. Brian, over to you.
Thanks, Arthur. Yeah, when we look at these initiatives, they are present. They're very far and few between, but there are initiatives within tertiary education facilities that enable cybersecurity to be a learned skill, and that makes it very likely for university leavers of those studying computer science with a speciality in cybersecurity to hop into an internal role. But the thing is, that's generally something that's managed by the institutions themselves. And we're not too sure about how deep government is investing in making these initiatives known and making these initiatives possible. Because at the moment, they're kind of only being pushed by the tertiary education institutions for the reason that they want to be ahead of the curve, because a lot of critical vulnerabilities are often discovered by universities, and they get to kind of hold the trophy on finding those vulnerabilities.
One other side of that issue, though, is that companies now have a responsibility when they onboard people, to use the HR term. In other words, when new people join an organization and they're going to be using any IT systems in that organization, that there has to be an initial awareness training program around cybersecurity. It's a non-negotiable, and it's the failure to have that kind of initiative that results in many losses and breaches. And certainly in the SME sector, where business owners typically have that responsibility and don't have the knowledge themselves, that you see most of the breaches happening. So we spoke earlier about the prevalence of ransomware attacks and the massive increase in attacks. The fact that so few corporates are breached in these attacks tells you about their security measures in place. But the fact that so many SMEs anecdotally are suffering from these kind of attacks tells you that they don't have the same level of protection as the corporates.
Great. If there are any more questions, you can either field them in the chat within the next few seconds. Otherwise, you can always just email us. You can reply to the email that contains the press release and the presentation.
We should answer most of your questions via the press release, the PowerPoint, and an infographic that we're going to be sending you shortly. Feel free to raise questions with Brian and myself, or with Dell. We'll provide a contact for Dell as well if you want to put questions to Kyrie. And we're available on an ongoing basis, as most of you will know. We're always happy to chat with the media. Thanks so much for attending. It was great to have you all with us.